Hi, folks. This is the third panel of the Anthropocene Conference 2022, and we have three speakers on this panel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the first speaker, Dr. Zimu Zhang. Her paper is Green Elegies, Ecofeminist Reading of Toxicity and Trauma in the Making of Chinese Ecological Civilization. Dr. Zhang is a researcher, curator, and moving image practitioner. She completed her PhD research on Anthropocene visuality and counter-visuality in contemporary Chinese visual culture at the School of Creative Media, City University of Hong Kong. She is the recipient of the 2022 Landhaus Fellowship at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, where she is now based in Munich. She is also a member of the Wenwu practice group that focuses on ecology and art research in East Asia. Together with friends, she co-founded Moonshine Screening Project in Guangzhou and Black Tent Theatre, also in Guangzhou Times Museum, focusing on the ecology and sociality of moving image and moving image activities. So without further wait, I'm going to invite Dr. Zhang to speak to us. Dr. Zhang, please.
Thanks, Jessica, for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen. I'm experiencing some, I think, internet issues, so let me know if you can see my screen without problem.
Yes, we can see your screen now very clearly now. Thank
sorry.
you.
Okay, so hello everyone. Oh wait, let me just, I cannot see. Okay, yes, thank you everyone. Really happy to be here and to be in this workshop and panel to dialogue with Professor Victor Fan and Professor Lo Kwai Chong on ecological civilization. So I will be sharing some also really preliminary thoughts today. So I want to discuss in a way to problematize the Chinese ecological civilization. So the talk today is termed Green Elegies, Ecofeminist Reading of Toxicity, Pains, and Traumas in the Making of Chinese Ecological Civilization. I argue that the ecological civilization functions somehow as a top-down reductionist greening movement that excludes migrant workers' sacrifices and subjectivities in its very own construction. So, maybe inspired by the ecofeminist framework, transcorporeal reality, as theorized by Stacy Alaimo, and rooted in material feminism, I will look into toxicity, pains, and traumas manifested in a series of non-state cultural productions on migrant workers, in order to reconfigure a grassroots ecological civilization. So the term of ecological civilization can be traced to a direct translation from a Soviet magazine, Scientific Communication, Scientific Communism in 1984, to Chinese Guangming Daily, where the original Russian word ecological culture was replaced with ecological civilization in its Chinese translation. This contextual adoption and linguistic choice in the translation paved the way for rendering ecological civilization as a discourse that has been used in the framing of Chinese communism and socialism under the ideological flagship of ecological socialist Marxism, in contrast with Western capitalism. They also sustain a visuality that draws a continuum between the harmonious relationship of humans and nature, inscribed in traditional Chinese culture and philosophy, with the obvious environmental degradation caused by Western-led industrialization. However, this idyllic unity of humans in heaven or nature, 天人合一 idea, was heavily questioned by sinologists such as Yu Ying-shih and Heiner Roetz, as it is more on ethical concerns and sagehood cultivation than ecological concerns. One of the main exponents of ecological civilization, Pan Yue, the former deputy director of China's State Environmental Protection Agency, situates ecological civilization with Chinese socialism ideology in a linear progressive model following primitive civilization, agricultural civilization, and industrial civilization. While Pan firmly beholds criticism of capitalistic extractivism and consumerism, his way, along with many Chinese mainstream framing of the socialist ecological civilization, is potentially prone to be forging a hegemonic model of urbanization, monoculture, and a technocratic visuality of the human-nature relation, overriding traditional indigenous knowledge and the grassroots vernacular worldings with multi-species community building and feral biodiversities. Both in the policy statements from the CPC and the actual practice of ecological civilization on local levels, scholars have observed the clear privatization of economic developments and technological systems. The emphasis on beautiful China in the discourse also speaks more of a harmonious, conflict-free, benevolent national image, with greening as a dominant aesthetic and environmental governance. It is closer to what Timothy Morton describes as bright green, that conveys a message to be affirmative, extroverted, and masculine, and healthy. It leaves little space for murky rivers, smoggy skies, diseased bodies, and much more dark ecological traumas. The public usage of civilization in Chinese cultural and sociopolitical space could be found in the 1988 TV documentary series River Elegy, which was a nationwide cultural sensation before its official ban, as it was conceived to be inciting 1989 student protests. The TV series had made explicit comparisons between two civilizations: traditional Chinese culture as inland, stagnant, and conservative, symbolized by the yellow civilization of the Yellow River, and the blue civilization symbolized by ocean expeditions and commerce activities led by the Western countries. Despite the reductionist and romantic view of the two civilizations, the film's vision for China as willing to embrace the blue civilization seems half-mad after 3 decades. When China has become the largest world economy and a crucial geopolitical actor in transborder projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. The River Elegy series carries a cultural motif as Dai Jinghua pointedly criticized as exercising a male elite's heroic voice who unconditionally embraced modernist myth and the exile of women and nature. Embedded in a similar developmentalist and technocratic civilization view, we may regard the ecological civilization as a green civilization, which is a remedy and a middle way for the collisions and frictions between the blue and yellow civilizations, to sustain continuous development against growing toxicity, catastrophes, and traumas manifesting in both the human and modern human worlds in the Chinese Anthropocene. I argue that an ecofeminist perspective is needed to disclose the hierarchical and patriarchal configuration of the ecological or green civilization discourse, in which industrial migrant workers, seen as low-end populations, are often ruled out of the making of many Chinese eco-smart cities. Transcorporeality, as stated by Alaimo, speaks about the time-space where human corporeality, in all its material fleshiness, is inseparable from nature or environment. She suggests that by emphasizing the movement across bodies, transcorporeality reveals the interchanges and interconnectedness between human corporeality and the modern human. The first case I want to examine today is the documentary The Verse of Us, directed by Qin Xiaoyu and Wu Feiyu in 2015. It mainly portrays 6 migrant worker poets with their poetry and workers' lives. They are Wu Niao, a forklift driver; Chen Nianxi, a mine blaster; Jike Ayou, a down-filling worker of Yi ethnicity; Lao Jing, a coal miner; Wu Xia, a garment worker; and Xu Lizhi, the young poet who worked in Foxconn and committed suicide. The film pays tremendous effort to map different migrant worker poets' creations with their labor environment and their hometown and inland villages. It provides a transcorporeal mapping of toxins and traumas with migrant workers' bodies across place and time. The opening sequence evoked poet Wu Niao's piece, Rust Parody on the Advance of Heavy Snow, in which the poet wrote about extreme snowstorm disaster in central and southern China in 2008. It was documented as the worst snowstorm and ice weather in the country's past 50 years. It was at a time when human-induced climate change as scientific fact and media discourse were much less resonant than today. Most people saw it as a real meteorological event. But we could see Wu Niao's sharp sensibility in connecting the out-of-control snow with the overload factory production and the visceral harm which made the female workers vomit froth. The disastrous man-made snow adds to the gradual but fatal collapse of the already undressed and catastrophic earth. Snow here is a symbolic material element of the capitalistic ethos, whose appearance is pure, beautiful, and unpolitical, just like made in China snow baubles for the Western family's Christmas trees, but actually bears a lethal weight on individual workers and planetary ecology. The visual sequence draws the transcultural landscape not only within workers' domestic working facilities, but within the global political economy. In the constant movement of the workers' bodies and their intimate contact with production materials, we could see how their bodies are carriers of exchanging material worlds, where mineral elements from deep earth, artificial chemical synthesis from factories meet and sediment. Being placed and displaced in different work conditions, their labor is so multifaceted and effective. Contrasting with stock footage often in Western media of factory workers who work numbly in assembly lines, passively in mines, they're shown as caught in fluctuating conditions and emotions when facing the powerful nature and machines. They challenge, conquer, yield, caress the more than human material and immaterial world. Toxicity and trauma generated from the industrial plants as well as uprooting of their traditional life. The scenes of Jikayu attending East traditional ritual back in Daliangshan, when his father lamented about the death of the local elder who did the black headband for deceased people. No one after the father's own death in the stockaded village will probably know how to see off death with traditional cosmology. Toxicity and trauma are shown in the chronic occupational diseases of the workers, as well as their families, who were also migrant workers or hard laborers without sufficient societal support. Chen Yanxi, who has multiple occupational diseases, including deaf lung, cervical spondylosis, hearing loss himself due to years of drilling and blasting rocks without proper protection, also has his father parallel in bed and his mother with cancer. Wu Xia's father, who was a migrant worker in Shenzhen earlier, suffered from severe depression. These pathologies of the body and psychic of the grassroots laborers further paint a picture of the structural and chronic violence of the developmental force. At the same time, impaired the healthy, bright green tone of the ecological civilization. The darkest trace of toxicity and trauma are on the worker's death, grieved in witnessing verses along with the open wounds of the material world. In Religious poetry and death, we comprehend the immense toxicity, pain, and trauma swallowed and endured by this young, talented, and sensitive worker poet with the bleak factory buildings, wire dorms, formula skywalks, along with his poetry on the iron moon, which he cannot endure and swallow anymore. In the scene, his brother spreads his ashes into the sea, following his death wish. We see the murky, rusty-colored seawater in the Shenzhen Longgang harbor due to busy shipping the industrial goods to the world. It is cruel but nevertheless possible to imagine that his ashes may not exceed another enduring afterlife by becoming part of the land factory plant again with Shenzhen's vast reclamation urban projects. While the film presents the very gendered migration workspace, what cannot be overlooked is the bundled emphasis of women's reproductive roles and their virtues, either being a poet's wife or a poet herself. Shown in the film uncritically, Wu Xia as the only female worker poet portrayed in the film mainly serves as the bright and beautiful tone among the other dark work ecologies. Her representation as a loving mother, filial daughter, a beautiful woman who adores dresses in the most classic association with femininity, risks overshining or shadowing her and other female migrant workers' unadorned pains and anger. Having several male voices over throughout the film, although to a level quite self-restrained than in River Elegy, it still sustains a dominant gaze from a male Han Chinese elite. The toxicity and pain are also contained and semi-pacified in the current worker generation, with a hopeful representation of childbirth towards the end. Here I cite scholar Wei Qingqi's words as a critique of this treatment. Chinese ecofeminism ought to take its own justification, not from investigating how close women are to nature, but from how close the way women are dominated to that nature is. In comparison, female poet Zheng Xiaochong, who had been working in Dongguan's assembly lines, the so-called Chinese wool factory, for many years, whose poems were cited in the film but not extensively featured. She wrote explicitly about female workers' embodied experiences of toxicity, pain, and trauma. In her poem Pain, she described an unresolvable pain. It reads, "There is nobody who could relieve her from physical, mental, actual, prospect pain. The machinery cannot, the boss cannot, the newspaper cannot, even that fragile labor law cannot either." Analyzed by Zhou Xiaojing, female migrant workers are the quintessential trans-corporeal subjects in Zheng's poems, as they're living everyday life with pollutants, toxic materials, natural or artificial made raw materials in the human manufacture of nature, while carrying out biological and effective reproduction, labors as daughters, wives, lovers, and mothers. In a series of poems named after individual female migrant workers' name, one named after Chou Rong documents her body pathologies in direct connection with industrial work in different age of womanhood. It extensively records, commiserates with the complexity of a migrant female suffering embodied with the industrial toxins and embedded with historical, societal patriarchy and global capitalism. From the inexhaustible pain documented in Zheng's poetry, you could further see a powerful resistance charged with righteous indignation from the female laborers in the documentary Outcry and Whisper, co-directed by Wen Hai and Zheng Jingyan, along with animation made by Trish McAdam. It traces a transcultural landscape where artists, migrant workers, intellectuals, as well as political dissents, united by the film narrative under their female identity and labor essence. In facing the surveillance, physical and mental abuses imposed on these female subjects, their resistance are fluid and multifaceted, corporeal and affective. As a marginalized group deprived with adequate social capital, they often resort to reveal and reenact their own embodied collective social pains. Very different from the silent grieving treatment in The Verse of Us, a visual sequence with hybrid forms mixing documentary footage, animation, and mobile phone archives shows the direct witness of suicidal drums of migrant workers. The pixelated red blood stain on the grounds screams out the transcorporeal pain of many individual men and women. It is also the bleeding of the earth beneath their lying bodies, sedimented with toxins, plastics, chemicals. As this presentation is coming to an end, to come back to the very discourse of ecological civilization, which emphasized on science and technology, Alaimo spoke about the importance of scientific information in transcorporeal mappings, but which demands a fundamental recast of scientism to a different science embodied by ordinary experts. As discussed in this presentation, the migrant workers embodied and embedded evidence of toxicity, pain, and trauma, particularly from female subjectivities, are the much needed scientific and effective knowledge to reconfigure the ecological civilization. As a further working direction and also an open ending of this work in progress presentation, I want to use these two images I documented myself in my visit to the Daozi village in Hunan province in 2018. There are many male workers affected with death lungs from working to build the Shenzhen miracle, but can only die in chronic suffocation without proper compensation and medical support. So was Sister Xu's husband. She kept this old cell phone with images and videos the husband recorded of himself during his gradually sickening conditions as a loving and painful remembrance. She often immersed herself in the old jacket of her husband that she didn't dare to wash so to keep his scent a bit longer. Apart from the public yet still domestic censored cultural productions I discussed earlier, there are vast vernacular media and object materiality, which we may refer to also as eco-media, that can serve as the factual, effective, scientific, transcultural mappings of the alternative grassroots ecological civilization. So this is so far my sharing of today. Thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to more discussions.